So the revolution in Estonia was many things. Born from decades of Soviet rule and before that, Nazi occupation, and truly a centuries old history of conquest and occupation. The revolution in the late 1980s was first and foremost about claiming their identity and their worth, their freedom from occupying forces, and their liberation from oppression. It is, as we heard in the story, best understood in terms of their music. Their music, their Estonian songs were the fuel that drove them to revolution. But let me be clear, the revolution in Estonia was not fueled by a bunch of new songs. The revolution was fueled by hearing their old songs in a new way. For Estonia, Muisama and their thousands of folk songs were part of their cultural imaginary. Now, as I understand it, the cultural imaginary or social imaginary is a collection of stories and symbols and ideas that surround a people's concept of themselves and a particular identity. Cultural imaginaries aren't false. That's not what imaginary means here. Rather, they inform how a people understand their collective identity. This is a remarkably common practice. We see cultural imaginaries built in Latino communities, LGBTQ communities, immigrant and refugee communities. The symbols and stories and mythos of our people, even the music and literature and dances and food and media all build together to create the cultural imaginary. So we can see from our story about the Estonian singing revolution, setting the Koidula poem in an inspiring choral composition reminded the people of the things that made them Estonian. And the song became embedded as a symbol of their cultural imaginary, which then helped them claim not just their cultural identity, but their very liberation. Now, we have our own cultural imaginary as Unitarian Universalists, built on the stories of John Murray and the shipwreck that led to the first Universalist sermon in America, the story of Henry David Thoreau and his 2 years in a cabin on Walden Pond, these stories about important people that are really legends that tell us who we are, even if they're a little light on facts. In religious movements, the cultural imaginary is built on stories, sacred texts, rituals, practices, and songs. For modern Unitarian Universalists, our cultural imaginary is grounded in the song Spirit of Life, which, believe it or not, took a lot longer to become our song than the legend would suggest. And more recently, Blue Boat Home, which is jokingly referred to as the Unitarian Universalist Freebird. But it's important to our identity, these songs that we sing. They tell us who we are and what we believe. It's said that people don't speak their theology as much as they sing their theology. And we sing ours in these books collected 15 and 27 years ago. Now, here's the thing. If, as Unitarian theologian James Luther Adam asserts, revelation is not sealed and there is always more for us to know and experience, then what does it mean when we're getting stuck in music that's decades old? Is our theology stuck in 2005 or 1993? Well, we know that's not true. Last year, the Commission on Institutional Change published their report, Widening the Circle of Concern, in which they call for a shift in our collective theologies to use the lens of liberation. Namely, what does it mean to view how we are Unitarian Universalists and how we understand our principles and sources when we consider not just freedom from constraints and our fairly common reliance on self-reliance, to considering those both inside and outside our congregations and their collective liberation from poverty and bigotry and oppression. When we change our view from how am I free from constraint to how are we liberated from oppression, we begin to understand the power of Unitarian Universalism to be about the tide raising all boats, to help create a world where truly all of us are free, to actually build the beloved community. When we change our view, our lens, we understand the power of Unitarian Universalism to affirm that none of us are free until all of us are free. That is liberation. That's what we're called to. And while there are a couple dozen songs in our hymnal marked freedom and none marked liberation, we know that it's there. And we know that art changes when we're not looking at it. When we go back and look again at some of these older songs, we see the liberation in there begging us to lean into it. We look at a song like Circle Round for Freedom, written by cantor Linda Hirschhorn, and suddenly we can see the collective liberation in it. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release. Circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children. Keep the circle whole. You hear it? Yeah. Even a song that uses I language like Oh Freedom, which is a folk song from the post-emancipation American South, suddenly these songs aren't just about one person, but are about every person praying for release from oppression. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my God and be free. Yeah. And this isn't just about freedom songs. So many of our hymns speak to this call to liberation of all. We heard some of them. Wake now my senses. My life flows on in endless song. Do you hear? It's in one more step. Be thou my vision. And so many more familiar, beloved hymns calling us to this work of liberating all. Now, this isn't to say that every one of our hymns can or should be seen through a liberative lens, and that doesn't mean that there aren't any more problems and they're all fine now. Some of our hymns show us evidence of how the moral arc of the universe has been bending toward justice, even in the last 27 years. I first realized this when I took up a spiritual practice of singing our hymns, one a day, both books. Soon I was blogging about my observations, researching the hymn's origins, histories, learning about usage, their composers, and exploring the theologies. And over again, I bumped up on phrases like brothers and sisters and dark and light and words like stand and run and walk and themes about conquest and empire. And it's not surprising. Remember that the Gray Hymnal Singing the Living Tradition was first commissioned before the end of the Cold War and was only published in 1993. The members of the commission were told to approach the new songs expansively. For them, it meant theologies, more humanism, more of the earth-centered traditions. It meant changing God language to be more inclusive and to include women. And they were at the end of the Cold War, the end of apartheid, the end of nuclear proliferation, and we had just been at war in the Gulf. So what was on our minds and in the minds of our hymnal commission was peace and freedom. By the early 2000s, when the Teal hymnal Singing the Journey was published, you'd think things would have shifted, and maybe they did a little, but again, we were at war again in Iraq, and so what was on our mind was peace and freedom. But since then, we have bent the moral arc toward justice just a bit more, having drawn the circle of love a bit wider. We learned about the gender spectrum, the doctrine of discovery, ableist language, critical race theory, intersectionality. And with all of these things, we have learned of the power of language to change the world and our minds and hearts. And what this means is that there are in our hymns some difficult language that are hard to sing in 2020. Art changes when we're not looking at it, and sometimes it just doesn't age well. So for many, for example, the hymn We'll Build a Land is about the beloved community, echoing the quote from Martin Luther King, who quoted the book of Amos in the Hebrew Scriptures. Come build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like water, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. And many among them, the Reverend Daniel DeBona, who is Native American, reminds us that yes, we can sing it, but you have to think about me and how my people's lands were stolen in the name of God. Oh, so is it a song of liberation? Is it a song of justice? Can we sing it? Should we sing it? This is what the work calls us to, challenging our assumptions, looking at what our language says, our music, all of the elements of our Unitarian Universalist cultural imaginary, and deciding what speaks the Unitarian Universalist language we most need in order to truly love the hell out of this world. It comes down to this. When we talk about widening the circle of concern in our world, in our denomination, in our congregations, and in our personal lives, we already have a pretty amazing tool at our disposal. These hymns that affirm not just peace and freedom, but songs, as we discover, affirm liberation. Songs that proclaim a call to justice, equity, and compassion. Songs that inspire us to act. Songs that challenge our assumptions. Songs that comfort and feed our souls for the long journey ahead. And yes, there will be some new songs. We have some of them already. You may know them. We shall be known by the company we keep. And where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. And the tide is rising, and so are we. Some beautiful songs coming out every day. Songs of liberation in our tradition. But even in these two books, in our living tradition, the tradition we hold close to our hearts, we have so much of what we already need to draw the circle wide. So let us build a new way. Let us sing a new way.